What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtnett. In today's episode, I'm going to be bringing a rundown of the Week 3 action, offering my predictions for the week ahead. Before I get into that, if you're going to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But let's dive straight into things, starting out with probably the best game of the weekend on Friday night. Number 20, Arizona at number 14, Kansas State. This game is at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central. Kansas State is home favorites by a touchdown. They are led by Avery Johnson at quarterback. He's accounted for 334 yards, 4 touchdowns, and an interception. And then, of course, on the ground is DJ Giddens with 238 yards. No touchdowns yet for the running back, but a overall good yardage for him. The Wildcats, it's a battle of Wildcats here, own the 4th best yards per carry average, so they might not be putting up a ton of yardage in terms of numbers, but every carry they're getting some good yards per carry there. They come in off of a close win over Tulane on the road. The Mean Green played them tough, but the Kansas State Wildcats were able to come away with the win. Jack Fabris added a 60-yard scoop and score in that one. And Avery Johnson, of course, is a dual threat as well, adding 77 rushing yards so far this year. On the flip side, Arizona's Noah Fifita at quarterback has thrown for almost 600 yards, 5 touchdowns. He does have a couple picks in the first 2 weeks. And, of course, his main leading receiver, main target, Totoiroa McMillan, has 315 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. They had a rough showing last week, including McMillan. He had just 2 receptions for 11 yards in a 22-10 win over Northern Arizona. They actually trailed 10-3 in the second quarter. And so those offensive issues are something they're going to need to address because the Kansas State defense has allowed just 33 points in the first 2 weeks. However, the thing to notice here is that Kansas State has allowed almost 500 yards of total offense, which I would say is probably right around middle of the road. It's not a ton of yards, but it's also not reflective of their points per game allowed, obviously around like 16.5. That's pretty decent. Kansas State has been pretty porous in terms of teams moving down the field, but have been pretty good when it comes down to red zone defense. Arizona, meanwhile, their defense improved drastically. They gave up 39 points in week 1 and then just 10 last week. I think Kansas State is the better team here. I believe this is actually a non-conference game, even though these teams are in the Big 12 conference together because it was scheduled before that conference realignment was announced. I'm going with the Kansas State Wildcats over the Arizona Wildcats, 31-27. I think Arizona does keep it closer than the spread indicates, though. Then moving into Saturday, it's a pretty weak slate overall after that Friday night game, but there's plenty of games that could be interesting. Starting things out, big noon kickoff on Fox. Number 4, Alabama at Wisconsin. The Crimson Tide are favored by 16. They scored 28 of the final 31 points last week in a 42-16 win over South Florida. Jalen Milroe has threw for 194 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Freshman wide receiver Ryan Williams has stepped up in a big way. Last week, he had 4 receptions, 68 yards, and a touchdown, and he has 6 receptions for 207 yards and 3 touchdowns so far this season. So he's kind of emerged as a main receiving threat for the Crimson Tide. Jam Miller and Justice Haynes have combined for 342 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns. And the Crimson Tide are tied for 3rd nationally with the most rushing touchdowns. Milroe as well is a part of that group with 4 rushing touchdowns himself. He did have a fumble inside the 10 against UCF, or a USF, right near the goal line. I don't remember exactly if the Bulls ended up scoring on that play, but just kind of a missed opportunity there that if Wisconsin can create some turnovers, it might be a little bit more dangerous for the Crimson Tide than it was against the Bulls. The Badgers, I think, played down to their opponent in the first 2 games, 28-14 win over Western Michigan, and then a 27-13 win over South Dakota last week. They do have a really good running back, Chaz Malusi, 35 rushes for 134 yards, 3 touchdowns. And then also joining him is Cade Yakimelli with over 100 rushing yards, and then Tawi Walker has a rushing touchdown. He's kind of been their guy to go to near the goal line. Tyler Van Dyke at quarterback has done a fair job so far, 406 passing yards, a touchdown, and then 1 rushing touchdown as well. I think this Badgers team can hang around with the Crimson Tide. They might be able to keep this game, in Camp Randall Stadium under that, 16-point favorite for Alabama, road favorites here, home dogs. That's certainly going to, I think, motivate Wisconsin. I could see this one being a touchdown game late, and then maybe a late turnover, return for a touchdown, or setting up the Crimson Tide near the goal line. I think it's going to be Alabama 34, Wisconsin 20. I think it's tough for the Badgers to get their offense really going in this one. Crimson Tide then, after this one, have a bye week, and then their tough slate really gets going. They go up against number 1 Georgia. They do host the Bulldogs on September 28th, already announced as a 7:30 kickoff on ABC. No surprise there. That's going to be the marquee game of week 4. Or week 5, I guess, at that point. Then, where College Game Day is going, I disagree with this decision, and I'll explain why in a couple of games here. It's number 16 LSU, who's 1-1, at number 2 South Carolina. LSU's favored by 7 here. LSU led Nicholls State just 23-21 with 10 minutes left in the third quarter. They got a touchdown right inside of that 10-minute mark to pull ahead, and they ended up winning by, I think, 20-something. Garrett Nussmeier, obviously, is an incredible quarterback. 610 yards, 8 passing touchdowns, which is tied for best nationally with Kyle McCord at Syracuse. And then his leading receiver, Kyron Lacey, with 4 receiving touchdowns, not surprisingly, is tied best nationally with Arizona's McMillan, who I mentioned earlier, and then Trebor Pena from Syracuse. South Carolina last week went into Lexington, I think probably underestimated, and were able to pull out with a huge 31-6 win over those Wildcats. Plenty of Wildcats here in the first few games, at least getting a mention. They had some shutdown defense, and then Lenora Sellers accounted for 2 passing touchdowns, and there was a big pick six, a 24-yarder by Nick Emanwari. I think the Gamecocks are going to be underrated going into this one as well. As you could see by the spread, LSU is favored, like Alabama, as a road favorite. I think South Carolina is able to stick around in this one. This one is a real upset watch. LSU obviously had that loss to USC, so they're pretty much playing with very minimal margins for error the rest of the way. I think they are able to execute. I think their passing offense is just a little bit too much for the Gamecocks to handle, but I think South Carolina is able to buckle down a little bit. This game, I think, is going to be a little bit lower scoring than expected. I'm going with LSU 27, South Carolina 23. Moving into another game at noon. This is actually the only other one at noon. Memphis 2-0 at FSU. This is actually, surprisingly enough, or I guess maybe not surprisingly, it kind of was going into the season. This is more important for Memphis regarding the college football playoff than it ever will be for Florida State. The Tigers come into this game 2-0. I think going into the season, they're the favorite in the American Conference. Meanwhile, Florida State's already 0-2. They would have to run the table the rest of the way, and with 2 ACC losses, even if they do that, they're probably not making the ACC title game, so they got to hope that a 10-2 resume with those losses to Georgia Tech and Boston College would be enough. So I guess technically there are still stakes here for the Seminoles, but their season has really been thrown into a blender and chewed up and spit out. This Tigers team have a good quarterback in Seth Hannigan and a good running back in Mario Anderson. This is a real upset watch. I think if this one was at the Liberty Bowl in Memphis, Tennessee, I think this would be a real upset. I would say almost a lock for an upset, but I do think Florida State will be able to get that first win on the board at Doak Campbell this season. I'm going to go with Florida State 23, Memphis 16. Then moving into a game in kind of somewhat of a standalone. I mean, it's going to be up against the noon window, but I think a lot of people, you watch those noon games up until this point, and then you flip over here. At 12:45 on the ACC network, we've got the lone ranked matchup this week. Number 24, Boston College, at number 6, Missouri. If you would have told me, even at the beginning of this year, that this game would be ranked, but especially if you would have told me before Mizzou's surprise turnaround last year, or I guess even, incremental improvement, I would have told you you're crazy. Saying this is the only ranked matchup, I would have said, probably I expect Alabama-Wisconsin to be a ranked matchup among maybe a couple of others this week. But this is the one that we've got. Missouri is a big home favorite by 17 points, but these Eagles are no team to overlook. Quarterback Thomas Castellanos has accounted for 428 total yards and 7 touchdowns. The Eagles also have 3 running backs with at least 100 rushing yards: Trayshawn Ward, Kai Robichaux, and Turbo Richard. And they also have a solid defense. Kari Johnson has a pick 6 this season, and Donovan Azuraku has 2 sacks on the season. Mizzou, meanwhile, quarterback Brady Cook has had a decent season so far. His yardage is up there, 456 yards, but he has just 1 touchdown and 1 interception. Luther Burden has often been double covered or covered by a team's best cornerback after the impressive season he had last year. He has just 7 receptions for 64 yards, but kind of in his place, Theo Weiss Jr. has stepped up, and they really haven't taken too much of a step back. He has 16 receptions for 179 yards. Couple of other things, though. Brett Norfleet is a decent tight end. He's been held in check the first couple weeks. I think this is a game that Boston College is certainly closer than the spread indicates. I think this is probably a touchdown game. I think the Tigers do get the win at home in Columbia, 31-24. Then moving into the 3:30 p.m. Eastern window, we've got some rivalry games in this one. Number 9, Oregon at Oregon State. The Ducks are favored by 16.5 as I'm recording. They've had 2 close calls so far, close wins over Idaho and Boise State. I think Boise State was fair. I think the way the Ducks played in that game was better. There's still a lot to work on, but it was better than week 1 against Idaho. They're going to go up against a Beavers defense that's allowed just 15 points through 2 games so far. I think Dylan Gabriel is going to find things difficult in this one. It's in Corvallis as well, so that's a huge test for these Ducks. I do think, though, they have a little bit more talent. That's often what's been the deciding factor in this rivalry most years, is that they have that. Obviously, Oregon State was able to get a win a couple years ago. I think that was the last meeting in Corvallis. So they'll be looking to repeat that. But I do think the Ducks are able to get a win in kind of a low-scoring game, 24-15. Then Tulane at Oklahoma. Real quick going through this one. Oklahoma's favored by 14. The Green Wave, as I mentioned earlier, played Kansas State really tough, and the Sooners struggled with Houston last week, who is pretty much more on caliber, I think, with Tulane than other Big 12 teams. Oklahoma, I think there's some things, Jackson Arnold's going to need to play better this week. I think he does. The fact that it's in Norman is also to their advantage, but I think Tulane keeps this one closer than expected. Oklahoma 27, Tulane 17. Next up, number 18, Notre Dame, somehow still in the top 20. And the top 25 isn't a shock, but top 20, I think, is too high for them. At 1-0, Purdue, the Irish are favored by 10. Obviously, last week, stunned by Northern Illinois, while the Boilermakers had a bye week after winning 49-0 versus Indiana State week 1. Hudson Card in that game threw for 273 yards and 4 touchdowns, and he's going up against a quarterback that has underwhelmed in his first 2 games. Riley Leonard, just 160.5 yards per game in his first 2 and 2 interceptions. I really do think this Irish team is going to be caught in a tailspin. I think it's tough for them to have to go into West Lafayette to play against the Boilermakers. I think Purdue looked pretty good in week 1. It is against an FCS opponent. I think not only does Purdue cover the spread, I think they pull the upset and they go to 2-0, and they show that the Big Ten's second tier, kind of behind, Ohio State, I guess maybe Penn State and Oregon. Right now, Ohio State's they've really separated themselves in the Big Ten so far. Still very early. They have a bye week this week. But second tier, a team like Nebraska and a team like Purdue might be able to get up into that second tier. I think the Boilermakers pull a big win over the Fighting Irish, going Purdue 24, Notre Dame 21, and throwing a little extra prediction here. Let's say it's on a game-winning field goal, just like last week, at this time as time expires. Then we've got the backyard brawl. 1-1 West Virginia, 2-0 Pitt. The Panthers had a big 28-27 win over Cincinnati last week. They came back from a 21-point deficit. Meanwhile, the Mountaineers, Garrett Green has thrown for just short of 400 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and has added 73 yards on the ground. As expected this season, C.J. Donaldson and Jaheim White have combined for 300 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. But Pitt's quarterback, Eli Holstein, has thrown for 635 yards, which is among the best in the nation, 6 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. I think this is an exciting game at Heinz Field. I think this could be one of the games that Pitt's really able to pack out. I just think West Virginia, because of their ability to run the ball really well too, it's not to say that Pitt can't, but their ability to run the ball really well in addition with Green's passing is what leads them to a victory 33-28. Then the Apple Cup. We have some of these early rivalries this week in, I guess, between Big Ten and Pac-2 foes this year. Weird to say that, not to say that they're Pac-12 opponents. Washington State 2-0 at Washington, who's 2-0. Quick prediction here. The Cougars were able to get a big upset win over Texas Tech last week, but I think Washington under Jedd Fisch is a little bit more talented even in his first year. It's at Lumen Field in Seattle, so that's still pretty much a home field advantage for the Huskies in this one. I'm going Washington 31, Washington State 27. Maybe a late stop for the Huskies. Then moving into the later window, I guess evening window, really not too many good games. I even tweeted about this one. It unironically is probably the best game in this window. 2-0 Indiana at UCLA. This is the Big Ten opener for the Bruins. It's their first Big Ten game. They narrowly edged Hawaii in week 1, 16-13. I think some of that might be down to traveling out to Hawaii, the 5, or I guess there maybe like 2 or 3 hour time difference. Obviously a long flight to get there. They get a bye. They'll be rested and recuperated under head coach Deshaun Foster in his first year. However, this Hoosiers offense has looked really good in their first 2 weeks. They've scored 108 points in the first 2 games under Curt Cignetti. I think the Hoosiers have a really good offense. Yes, those have been against lesser opponents, but I think they're able to come into the Rose Bowl. I think they're able to put up some points. I wrote down 31-17, but I think I'm going to up the scoring for both teams and go with IU 38, UCLA 24. Then another game here, Big 12 game. I believe this is a Big 12 game because UCF's been in the conference for a couple years now. 2-0 UCF at 2-0 TCU. Josh Hoover has thrown for 620 yards and 4 touchdowns for the Horned Frogs. But R.J. Harvey has rushed for 268 yards for the Knights offense. So this is kind of a clash. TCU likes to pass the ball. UCF likes to run it. I think TCU has a little bit more dogs on their side, or I guess frogs, maybe you could say. I'm going to go with TCU 37, UCF 34. I think in terms of entertainment value, this one could be the best one to watch. And don't forget about KJ Jefferson at quarterback for the Knights, transferring in from Arkansas this offseason. Finally, 8:30, there really aren't any late games. I mean, true college football sickos will stay up this weekend to watch the late window, but at 8 p.m. Eastern, 1-1 Maryland at 2-0 Virginia. The Terrapins on the road, in spite of a loss last week to Michigan State, are favored by 2.5. This is an instance of a passing attack. Maryland's Billy Edwards and Virginia's Anthony Colandrea have thrown for a combined 1,218 yards, 10 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions this season. I think kind of like the UCF-TCU game, this is one you might want to tune into late after that one goes final, assuming it ends first. It does start half an hour earlier. I think it'd be a good idea to switch over to this game as kind of the nightcap in terms of, the good games that maybe actually mean something. The Cavaliers have emerged as the team in Virginia. A lot of people expected Virginia Tech, myself included, to be the team out of the state that was a college football playoff contender. I'm not ready to say that Virginia is a CFP contender yet, but I think they do get a big win over a solid Big Ten team. They have the home field advantage at Scott Stadium in Charlottesville, so I'm going with Virginia 34, Maryland 30. But that wraps up my Week 3 predictions. Let me know in the comments below what your predictions are for these games, what you think about my predictions, and what you're looking forward to, and a little bit of a step down for Week 3 in terms of entertainment and big games. But thank you so much for taking the time to watch College Football Talk with Peter Burnett, and have a great rest of your week. Tune into those games on Saturday, and I'll be right back here for a rundown of the action. I'm signing out. Peace.